I love talking about technology that can make the world a better place. And today we're going to be talking to a solar company that is doing just that. So stay tuned. Today I have with me Angelo Campus, CEO and founder of BoxPower.io, a company that is helping to bring renewable energy to where it is most needed. They are building solar power systems that fit into standardized shipping containers that can be deployed anywhere. They got their start in bringing power to hurricane-ravaged Puerto Rico in 2017, and now they are working with utilities to bring power to remote areas. So let's talk with Angelo about how all this works and where this is all going. Welcome, Angelo.
Thank you, Chris. Glad to be here.
I'm excited to talk to you about this. I'm a big supporter of anything we can do to cool this planet down at this point. Considering we're just coming off of multiple hurricanes here, and there seem to be more behind that, and just a lot of environmental chaos. But even more so, we're heading into wildfire season, and that's another sweet spot for you. But I like the idea of where are you going with the modular approach to this, and just having a kind of self-contained piece to this. But could we start with, I know you've had an interesting history, and this is a very personal journey for you in making this company work. Can you talk a little bit about your kind of personal journey and your story, and how you got to where you are today?
Sure, happy to. And unrelated, I'm curious, how many 100-year disaster events do we have to have in 10 years before we redefine what a 100-year disaster event means?
I think we're going to have to spend a lot of time redefining that this year.
My thoughts with the people of Florida and North Carolina right now as they suffer.
It's rough.
Yet another catastrophe. So my background has always been in energy. In fact, all the way back to a little kid, I was fascinated with energy and electricity, and I owe part of that to my community and my parents. My father was involved in the solar industry from a very early stage. Actually started a solar company when I was in high school, and so I was exposed to technology, exposed to energy. And I also lived in a very rural area. I was 15 minutes down a dirt road, and not off grid, but when the power went out, the power was often out for a week, sometimes 2 weeks before the utility could restore it. So it was a common occurrence of my childhood to spend a week cooking food on camp stoves and eating dinner by only candlelight. And, this energy that I think a lot of people maybe grow up taking for granted, never thinking about where it comes from or how it's delivered, was a very real and material thing in my life. Both seeing my father build a company around solar and experiencing the unreliability of it gave me a really deep fascination.
Multi-generational solar person here.
Yeah. And another little known fact, I'm here in Grass Valley, California, right next to Nevada City, Northern California. We have a very deep solar history here, going all the way back to the late 70s when Nevada City was home to one of the very first retail locations where you could purchase a solar panel, claiming all the way back in 1979 at a store called the Earth Store. You could buy a solar panel. And that is, to the best of mine and many others' knowledge, the first retail location where an individual could buy solar. And so there's some deep roots here. And I think and
a lot has changed since those times. It'd be interesting to take a look at, I assume that store is probably no longer there.
The building it is something else now. But
in terms of the capacity of those solar panels they were selling, the cost of those solar panels, I would imagine it's just orders of magnitude different now.
They were, I believe it was a 12-watt solar panel that, was $30 or $40 per watt. We are now at 30 or 40 cents per watt for 500-watt solar panels. So it's an entirely different landscape.
Multi-generational solar person here. And, you're looking at, you're living through the reality of the unreliability of just having a solar panel. Because I got to imagine back in the 70s when we're talking here that, there wasn't a lot of battery storage and things like that. So, like the intermittency of, sun was a substantial challenge then. Like how did all that experience translate into you creating Box Power, and sort of like what was all the motivation? Because I know you saw a lot of things going on that you wanted to fix, and so that was sort of how Box Power came to be. But could you talk a little bit about what those things were?
I had an incredible opportunity. I got a full ride scholarship to go to Princeton University for an engineering degree. First
That's a good
generation
school.
college student in my family, first from my high school to go to an Ivy League in 10 years. And I had an incredible fortune there to meet a professor who was working on microgrids. And microgrids were like a new concept for me, but it was the idea of not just a solar system, but a truly independent, autonomous energy system that used renewable resources, but to provide a more reliable, less intermittent source of power. And so, as a civil engineering major and an anthropology minor, I really had two interests. I had energy and infrastructure and everything that went into it. And I was also really fascinated with places where energy wasn't historically available or wasn't reliably available. So generally,
Right.
the developing world. One of the really formative experiences or historical events that happened at that time for me was I believe it was 2010 Haiti earthquake,
Right.
where an earthquake decimated Haiti's energy infrastructure to the extent that is never fully recovered. And the one of the largest barriers to recovery efforts was lack of electricity. More people died from preventable diseases in the 2 years following the earthquake than during the earthquake itself. And that was because of a lack of refrigeration, a lack of water filtration, and generally a lack of power. Disaster relief organizations shipped in generators, but then there was no supply chain to deliver fuel to these remote locations. And so it was a humanitarian catastrophe. And that was at a very formative time, as a freshman in college. And the professor that I was working with had the idea to start a research group on rapidly deployable microgrids. And it was directly inspired by the disaster in Haiti and witnessing these news reports coming out of another 100,000 dead due to cholera and malaria. The professor said, we have tools for this. We have solar panels, we have battery storage, we have the ability to productize and deploy systems like this. And so that professor started a research group, and I was a founding, an inaugural member of that group that was working on developing rapidly deployable containerized microgrids. The theory that we could take these existing technologies, solar, battery, wind, inverters, productize them into something that could be shipped into a remote location, quickly set up, and provide a source of power comparable to a generator, but not dependent on constant delivery and refueling of fuel. So that was the inception of what became Box Power. And I spent 5 years working in that research group with that professor before deciding that I wanted to start a company focused on that with the blessing of the university and the research group. And I started Box Power my senior year with a very similar thesis. Can we make microgrids into a product that can be mass produced, rapidly deployed, and deliver a cleaner, more reliable, more affordable source of power to remote areas?
From the anthropology perspective, right? And you're taking a look at, like, for example, the telephone networks, right? We like in the United States, we've got the POTS lines and things like that. We put up all this copper wire, wired everything up, and like you look at developing countries, and it's like, well, that's a lot of work to do, right? but a lot of them were able to leapfrog a lot of that progress by just going straight to cellular technology, and then they don't have to lay in all that infrastructure. And it's a much faster, more efficient and effective method of doing that, because that's a lot of work. And I got to imagine that a similar thing is true about power infrastructure.
Well, actually, I love that you use the term leapfrogging. That was something we looked at in anthropology of as new technologies enter. We play with a term called reverse leapfrogging. And that's actually giving credit to the fact that the work that we do here, which I guess to rewind a step is our core business is providing microgrids in remote areas of the US, where we are replacing existing distribution infrastructure that is either too dangerous, too unreliable, or too expensive for the utility to maintain with rapidly deployable microgrids. As a new concept.
That's a good point. I was thinking more of like just, completely underserved, but the reality is you're taking a look, because I mean that's another aspect of this. You're preventing other environmental issues too with where you're deploying these and solving problems that have crept up, right?
4 years ago, we deployed the first utility-owned, fully off-grid microgrid serving a rural community, and just a year and a half ago, we deployed the first 100% renewable remote microgrid serving a remote utility customer owned by a utility. And this is a brand new concept for utilities in the United States, that they can deliver power with locally renewable source generation close to the customers. But I have to stop and give credit to the developing world, that this has become one of the major models of electrification in sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, India. And so I use the term reverse leapfrogging. I don't claim credit for the idea of a utility-owned mini grid. PowerGen and Husk Power and these really pioneers established and developed these business models and this technology in the developing world. And it's now coming back to the developed world as natural disasters and as climate change make that infrastructure, those phone lines that we built in the 1950s when labor was cheap and there were no environmental regulations, it's no longer cost effective to maintain it. And so we're now bringing models of electrification that were proven in developing markets to solve electricity issues here in the US. And that's what I call reverse leapfrogging.
That is an interesting perspective. We don't always think of some of the developing countries having, technology for us, but, there's a lot of really interesting things just on like a water production, clean water production and things like that. There's a lot of actually interesting things happening in these places that would be very beneficial to us. I think so it's interesting. A lot of the infrastructure that you're replacing is really like super inefficient technology, because either when you go to rural areas, you either got to run just miles and miles and miles of cables and infrastructure to get the power out there from some sort of centralized generation point, or you're relying, as we were talking earlier, about really filthy, dirty diesel generator systems and things like that. And then you have that whole logistics supply chain of getting the fuel to those things and that sort of thing. Can you talk about the benefit of putting these systems in?
A couple stats to think about. More than half of the infrastructure serving power in the US, so distribution wires, transformers, substations, power generation, is already past its expected life. Meaning when it was installed...
Probably by about 100 years.
When it was installed with a 50-year expected life, we have power poles across this country, wooden power poles that are 7 years old and rotting and falling apart. One of the most catastrophic fires in California history was started by a transmission pole wire rusting and falling off and sparking a catastrophic wildfire. Our energy infrastructure as a country is crumbling. And electricity loads are growing at unprecedented rates. We have the electrification of everything. We have electric vehicles. A report came out.
AI. I mean, it's crazy what I'm seeing now from AI is, they're bringing 3 Mile Island plant back online, and Microsoft has an exclusive license to all that power to generate for their AI implementations, which is crazy. And we're talking about nuclear all over the place for that. I mean, like we are straining it. So I think, like when you're looking at stuff like that, where's rural going to sit in the hierarchy of needs, in the country, right?
An interesting stat I like to throw out is that for an electric vehicle charger, you've got level 1, level 2, level 3, level 2 and level 3 are what are more common. Level 2 is a 7 kW charger. A level 3 DC fast charger is up to 350 kilowatts. That is as much power as, depending on the home, over 100 homes. So if you think about a charging bank of 10 DC fast chargers, which we need on every interstate, every quarter, and every town to enable electrification, we're adding hundreds of the community-sized loads all over our grid, and the infrastructure is simply not able to support that. And so the way that I think about our role in that and microgrids is utilities, their technology hasn't changed fundamentally in 100 years. And what I mean by that is centralized generation, synchronous spinning machines, transmission, distribution. And it's all radials from centralized generation and out. And so when you have an issue like capacity out at the end of the line, you have to go back and fix it all the way back to the substation or even to the transmission level, or sometimes all the way back to the generation level. And it is incredibly expensive. But now we have inverter and battery-based technologies. Really, I'd say, in the last 10 years, but really in the last 5 years of becoming widely commercially accepted and technologically proven. It's not science projects anymore. It's real vetted products that can solve these issues for utilities in new ways. If you have a distribution line that is unreliable, instead of having to rebuild 10 miles of distribution line at over $1 million per mile, the utility can now put in a battery at that critical customer at the end and solve that reliability issue for a fraction of the cost. Similarly, with electric vehicle charging going in, a substation over capacity, say it's a 20 megawatt substation, and now with this new DC fast charging load, it needs 25 megawatts or 30 megawatts. Well, historically, that's a $50 million substation rebuild project. That is a massive infrastructure upgrade. With microgrid technology now, you add a 5 or a 10 megawatt battery to that system that can charge when loads are low, discharge when loads are high, and solve the issue in such a more elegant, geographically sort of constrained way. And so I believe that we're in a new golden age for utilities of having a whole new set of tools and solutions to the problems of the 21st century, of climate change-induced natural disasters affecting reliability, aging infrastructure, and growing loads. So I think it's a very exciting time to be in the energy infrastructure space.
No doubt. And I want to touch on the specifically interesting take you guys have on it. But before we get there, I just want to, because I know we've mentioned some terms, I want to make sure people, understand what you mentioned, like inverter a couple of times. And I want to make sure people understand why that's important.
Yeah. An inverter is what makes power useful. So a lot of solar is produced as DC electricity. Right. Batteries store DC electricity, but most of our appliances don't use DC electricity. What's in our house is AC electricity, what runs our lights. And so inverters are what take either that energy being produced by solar or stored by batteries and make it,
which is a DC power.
Which is a DC power source. They make it usable. They convert it to AC. They regulate the voltage and the frequency. They control it. They're a mixture between a valve on a water tank and a filter that cleans the power, puts it into the correct voltage, the correct frequency, and at the right amount for what you need it. So they are, in many ways, the brain of renewable energy systems and microgrids.
Okay, so now I want to get back to like BoxPower's particular take on this, because there's a reason why you're called BoxPower. And I really love sort of the modular approach that you're taking to this, and especially when you're talking about microgrids and just, being able to deploy them. I mean, I got to imagine, I know we've talked before, it's a very relative to like energy infrastructure projects, the deployment of one of your systems is orders of magnitude faster than any of those types of things. So like the fact that you can actually, potentially walk in sort of a disaster scenario, or, the reality of this is most likely going to be when, power companies are like, well, we're having a massive outage in this place and now we can't fix it. What do we do? Rather than having those extended outages, this is something that could be used to bring those communities back up quickly, right? Can you talk to like the whole what BoxPower is doing? It's a cool thing here.
So when we started BoxPower, our observation was that microgrids were a brand new technology, a brand new idea, and most of the microgrid projects being built were, for lack of a better word, sort of science projects. They were highly customized, requiring extensive engineering, testing, long, slow design cycles, longer and slower installation and testing. And you couldn't buy a microgrid. It was not something that could just be procured or purchased.
Right.
You needed an energy consultant and an engineering firm and an EPC and an integrator to put together this sort of bespoke and one-of-a-kind system. And our mission was and is simple. We want to make microgrids into something that can be purchased and procured and deployed. In the same way that when you go and buy a car, you don't specify how many teeth you want on the third gear transmission. Like, there's a couple of options. Right. There's different size cars. There's some, different levels of trim that you might pick, but it's a product. Same thing with generators. Right. You can buy a generator. You don't have to pick which alternator and which engine go together. It's what we are doing for microgrids. So we pre-engineer, standardize, prefabricate, and integrate these containerized modular systems that are not only the battery storage, but the inverter, the monitoring, the controls, in some cases, the solar as well, mounted to the top of the container. And we have tried to simplify microgrids down to a product, a configurable, but a limited option configurable product that can be purchased. And because of that, it can be procured much more quickly. It can be prefabricated. We can hold inventory of them. So when it's procured, it can be delivered much more quickly. And because it's pre-integrated, you don't need specialized electricians on site to put it together. It's a purely mechanical assembly. I joke I always wonder if they're going to sue me for saying this, but we're the IKEA of microgrids. Like, hey, it even comes with the tools you need in the box to put it together, is the approach that we've taken. And because of that, it makes the deployment faster, the installation faster, the cost significantly lower. It allows us to manage quality control and testing in a much more rigorous fashion in a factory environment.
I got to imagine there's economies of scale too. If you can like maintain inventory, you can buy in greater quantities and play that arbitrage game too.
The ability to manage supply chain risk and manage long lead time and supply chain delays. And so that is
well, and like for people who haven't worked on, like big power projects, the lead time on some of that stuff can be significant. Yeah. I mean, like, especially like with things like transformers and stuff like that, especially when you get into the big ones. I mean, some of that, like the lead time's a year out minimum.
And so that was our approach to hardware. And so we have these modular microgrid products, and then we've expanded beyond that because we realized beyond just the hardware, people needed help figuring out what size microgrid they needed and what was their energy tool. So we started developing software.
Supersize it. I'll take a number 5 and supersize it.
We started building software tools that would help analyze a customer's load data, optimize what size microgrid they need, configure it, and then give them a price. Like, here, click order. This is what you need. And so that is our energy audit and system integration, easy platform, EASI software platform. And then also realize that once microgrids are deployed, customers need help monitoring and maintaining them. So we're also in the operation and monitoring software business, providing the tools so that, you don't need to pull out your computer and command prompt into the system to figure out if your battery's working. You get an automated monthly report on your system performance and savings. And so
and that's super valuable, because those monitoring systems, when you talk about an antiquated world of power generation and things like that, those all like SCADA systems and things like that are just like really, really
designed
antiquated.
in the 90s and haven't been updated since. Yeah.
No.
All of that is say we have done our best and continue to strive to simplify microgrids, to make them something that is understandable, procurable, replicable, and scalable. And that's what BoxPower is all about.
And so when we're talking about the boxes are actually standardized like shipping container sizes.
Stack them,
right?
rack them, ship them, move them around. Intermodal transport containers. They are the one of the few standardized things. We have metric and imperial, we have Fahrenheit and Celsius, but the whole world uses intermodal Connex transport containers, and that's what our systems are all prefabricated inside.
People don't realize how huge an innovation the shipping container was in the world. I mean, it allowed for standardizing of shipping and rail transport and intermodal, like all that stuff.
Yeah, there's an incredible book. I don't remember the author's name, but it's called The Box, how the shipping container made the world, that I highly recommend for anyone who's really likes to nerd out about internet.
It's very nerdy, but it's a very cool story. It's a very cool story. And there's a lot of inspiration to be taken from that, because, just like the act of standardization can change the world. And it seems like such a sort of bureaucratic, mundane thing, but like some of these little things are so important. And I think it's obviously, and here's another great application of the shipping container, right? So now another thing that also too, I mean, you can fit up to a certain amount of power in a single shipping container, right? But beyond that, you can build, this is a scalable, brick by brick kind of technology. I mean, you can add multiple containers here and multiple boxes and just keep building your grid, right?
So I point to the word modularity is something we think a lot about.
Modularity.
I was an avid, I would say, obsessed Lego collector, builder, tinkerer as a kid. The untold hundreds of hours I spent playing with Legos as a child, I think really influenced the way they think about design. We need interoperable, compatible connection of devices. Building a system should be about combining the right set of bricks together that link together and turn into something greater than the sum of their parts. And that's the approach that we've taken to microgrid design as well, is scalable modular battery systems that, rather than for projects of different size having to re-engineer a system, our systems are parallelable, allowing you to interconnect multiple of our modular containerized battery systems to meet a very wide range of system sizes, ranging from singular or small groups of customers up to community scale microgrids, without having to start from scratch for each one.
From like your smallest box, because it's not like I think I've seen like the smaller boxes are not, like full container, that you're typically see on the back of a truck, to the like that full container, like what sort of power capacities do each of those have?
So we have a product called the mini box. I'm actually proud to say my house is powered by a mini box. I do. Oh,
that's cool. I do
eat our own medicine. And the mini box was designed to power a single home. And you're right, it's not a 20-foot shipping container. It's a smaller dining table size, sort of palletized system, but it was designed to stack inside of shipping containers, and we can stack.
It's a fractional size of a
We can
shipping
stack
container.
12 mini boxes inside of a standard 20-foot shipping container. Fun fact.
That's pretty cool.
And so that is our single customer microgrid system. That can be residential. It's also for small loads like telecom towers, monitoring sites, small remote sites. Then we have our solar container product, which is the 20-foot shipping container platform. Each one of those can have an output ranging from 25 to 150 kW, and then multiple can be stacked together. And so that is your multi-residential to small community systems. I use some ranging from a single to 10 of those linked together.
So how much did you say that the single one will do?
The smallest one, or the smallest?
The smallest one. How much does that, like, for the single house sort of generation system?
So that's a 5 kilowatt solar array, a 20 kilowatt hour battery, a 7 kilowatt inverter, and a 7 kilowatt backup generator.
So people have a perspective, like what is the power consumption of a typical house?
It's a wide range. I can tell you what the US averages is about 30 kilowatt hours per day, which equates to an average consumption of just over 1,000 watts, continuous average. In reality, it's not a continuous average. We use most of our electricity when we are home cooking. So typical residential curve is in the morning, everyone makes their coffee and then goes to work and then comes back in the evening and cooks dinner and watches TV. So you have this sort of double humped camel sort of load profile, but an average of 30 kilowatt hours per day. And so that smallest system, the mini box, it'll produce on average 20 to 25 kilowatts. So it's sort of on the energy efficient home side of a typical residential load profile, all the way up to the larger solar containers that can power 5 or 10 homes simultaneously.
And then you can interconnect them all too. I mean, I would imagine if you get like 25 out of that, the smaller one, you could put two together. I would imagine too, right? To double your load, double your pleasure, just like double gum, right? Double your pleasure. I think that's super interesting. I would love to have something like that. I love the idea of the microgrid. I don't want to be dependent on, because I think I would probably be more on the 50 kilowatt, side of things based on what ComEd sends me, every month. It's like, here's you compared to your neighbors. You consume way more power. I'm like, I just I have absolutely no idea who's using that little power in their house, because I don't feel like I'm using a ton, but I do have, servers and I'm, got bright lights and things like that. So I guess, okay, fair. I probably use more than I should. But yeah, no, I mean, so I would love to have that and just get off of like the dependence on ComEd, which is, unreliable. And, I've seen the infrastructure from working on building data centers and things like that. And it does not give me confidence. And especially when you look at sort of the broader, grids of the US and how they're all interconnected and how they work, they're the potential for sort of a catastrophic cascading failure across, large regions of the US, which we've seen before, is a bit unnerving. And as dependent as we are on power, it gives one pause.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna disappoint you here, and maybe disappoint some listeners. Unfortunately, microgrids are still expensive, and they're outside of the cost of the average individual. So like the small residential size system, if we were to sell them direct to resident, which we don't do, we work almost exclusively with the utilities. You're talking about starting at $50,000 for a whole home system, and like for most people, that's a ton. I mean, we do spend that on cars, but it's
I mean, like I got a battery like that in my garage right now, right? So,
but an interesting thing that we made a choice to do is work with utilities.
I will bring us back to the very beginning of this conversation when we talked about that retail shop. that was selling low power solar panels for however $300 a kilowatt or whatever it was.
A lot.
Kilowatt, yeah. As things progress, they do become less expensive. And when you start at the beginning, I mean, that was a very expensive solar panel for a very select group of people who were willing to do that. And as technology progresses, it becomes more affordable for the everyday person, and you start to see it in more places. So I'm excited about that prospect too.
An interesting thing, an idea that we, and sort of a basis of why we work with utilities, is the idea of we all get our electricity bill, and that electricity bill has an amount of consumption and a cost per unit of consumption, a cost per kilowatt hour. What very few of us ever think about is, what is the actual cost of delivering that power to me? How much profit is the utility making on that cents per kilowatt hour? And what I think many people will be very surprised to hear is that if you live outside of a major metropolitan area, they're losing money on providing power to you. Utilities are a fascinating model because it's a protected monopoly. There's not a traditional free market competition there. They are regulated, their profit margins are regulated. And in exchange for that, what they have to do is provide an average cost of power to their entire constituents. And what that means is there are constituents where it is cheaper for them to provide power and they make a significant profit on it. But for most rural consumers, where they have to build miles of distribution line to serve remote communities or remote customers, their cost of delivering power can be factors or even orders of magnitude above the price that you pay for energy. And so that was what led us to working with utilities, because the commercial solar sector, the commercial battery sector, they're all growing, they're doing well. They all deal with the average cost of power. They are selling electricity back to the utility and getting some approximation of either the average retail or the average wholesale rate. What we look for is, by working with the utility, we try and find the places where the utility is spending the most to deliver that power, where they are losing the most money to deliver power to a consumer. And that's often rural areas, remote areas, places with low reliability, where they're having to send service trucks out regularly. And so by working with the utility, we work to solve very specific cost challenges within the grid. The spots where it is too expensive to repair a distribution line, too expensive to increase the reliability, too expensive to increase the capacity with traditional means. And that's been our thesis of helping utilities adopt these new technologies.
And I will point out that those costs do come back to the consumer in the big city as well. I mean, either as a direct cost of a percentage of your bill that is, apportioned to those things, or just in neglected infrastructure because they're not making enough money to, fully support what you're using.
They're driving up that average. They are the extreme on that average cost of delivered power that is making it more expensive for everyone.
I think there's another interesting aspect to this too. I mean, there's sort of there's obviously a lot of regulatory issues in this space. But, I know a lot of, like here in Illinois, a lot of the power companies are mandated to have a certain amount of, renewable energy as part of their energy mix. And like the traditional way that utilities go about doing things is these massive projects. I mean, this is another way for them to address some of those regulatory issues and do it in a quick and efficient and lower cost potential way of putting that together, right?
I mentioned earlier we did the first 100% renewable remote grid project, and it was a very interesting project with PG&E. You can find information, articles on it online, searching for the Pepperwood Preserve Remote Grid with PG&E. It was nominated and received a number of awards. The situation there is there was a single customer at the end of a 3/4 mile line, 0.7 miles of line serving them. And it was in a very high-risk area where PG&E, to remove that fire risk, was going to need to underground that line. But the cost of undergrounding, the average cost, is $2.5 million per mile.
Right.
And so for that single residential customer, they were going to spend almost $2 million to underground a line serving a single customer.
If you can even do it, because you got to get right of way and all that too.
Exactly. Rather than doing that, we took the customer off grid for PG&E. And because of its location in California, because of the shape of their load profile being driven by summertime cooling as opposed to wintertime heating, which because of time of day and winter is harder to meet with renewables than cooling, we were able to design that system to be 100% renewable. There is no backup generation. There is no fossil fuel generation. 100% of the electricity being delivered to that customer is generated on site with solar. That is the only customer in California that is in compliance with PG&E and the state's 2050 climate goals to have 100% of our electricity delivered by renewable energy resources. And so we achieved it with a 100% off-grid system. And it's the first time the utility has served a customer with 100% year-round renewable resources.
That's a really cool story. That's something to feature on the website for sure. I'm sure you do.
Yep.
And I got to imagine like PG&E, that because you referenced that down power line that started the big, forest fire. That was a huge settlement for them. There will be a huge settlement for them. I mean, that's going to cost them a lot of money. So they got to be excited about the prospect of not having to have, all that rickety and dangerous infrastructure out there starting more fires too, right?
And the terrible thing is everything we just said could refer to several incidents. It is not an isolated incident, and it's not isolated to PG&E. Unfortunately, a growing number of our most catastrophic wildfires on the West Coast have been started by utility distribution infrastructure. And it's a major risk for the utilities, a major liability, a major cost for them, and a major public safety issue. And it's historically people thought, wildfires, California. Yeah, we've been dealing with this for a while. I hate to break it, it's not just California anymore.
Well, look at Canada.
The entire West Coast, Canada, Hawaii. Did anyone expect
Hawaii.
Catastrophic community-destroying, devastating wildfire in Hawaii?
Yeah.
I come back to where we started with, we're having all of these, oh my God, that is a 1 in 100-year event. That's just crazy.
And I got to think too, like with these hurricanes, the damage I'm looking at, they're wiping out all the power lines and all that stuff. I mean, at some point, it's got to be just easier to like pick up a box and drop it in a community, or a bunch of boxes, and once you get the road cleared, get it out there and hook it up.
I think I looked online. I think there were 3 million out of power in Florida. And to bring that full circle, one of our first markets where we did a lot of work in 2018 was Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria. Was the first disaster that we responded to, shipping our boxes into areas that had been impacted by the hurricane that wouldn't have their grid power restored for almost a year after the hurricane initially hit. We were there a couple months after the hurricane hit with chainsaws cutting fallen trees and poles out of the street to deliver a containerized system to a school resiliency center in Humacao, southeast area of Puerto Rico. And so it's a challenging time that we live in, and it requires new tools, new strategies, new approaches to dealing with runaway rampant climate change and an aging grid that was never designed to contend with these challenges, let alone in its aged state of disrepair that it's in.
What's next for BoxPower? Where are you going to go from here?
We're working with utilities across the West Coast, primarily in their wildfire mitigation efforts. We work with utilities to identify where their highest risk lines are and the feasibility to replace them with microgrids, allowing them to either permanently decommission and remove the lines or de-energize them for extended periods during wildfire risk. And so that concept, born in California, pioneered by utilities like Liberty Utilities and PG&E, is now being adopted by utilities across the West Coast, looking at more cost-effective ways to eliminate their wildfire risk and maintain reliability for their customers. But I see that as just the first application of microgrids for these utilities. And pun intended, because there's a fire under their ass to do something about this distribution.
I don't even know if that's a pun. That's the reality of the situation.
But there's so many other problems that microgrid technology can solve for the grid. We talked a little bit about EV charging, constrained capacity. I heard recently that for new housing developments in California, one of the biggest changes is it can take years for the utility to get them power, to get them that capacity.
And as an EV owner, I will say, like, we need way more chargers along the routes.
Yeah.
And, some of them, the problem is, like, when you get into the middle of the country, there's like nobody there.
Yeah.
So it's not like there's infrastructure there for people to, light up or anything like that. So this would be a really great solution for charging. The challenge is, like you mentioned, EVs require a lot of power.
Yeah.
So,
Our company motto is energy anywhere. We're trying to decouple the geographic disparity of energy access. And I'd be remiss if not bringing up to one of the biggest areas of energy inequality in the U.S. is on indigenous and tribal lands.
Yes.
If you go on the World Bank website, the U.S. lists 100% electrification. And what that really is a rounding up of 99 point something. But that's not evenly spread across the population of the United States. 30% of Native Americans living on reservations do not have access to grid electricity, have not been served by the traditional electrical grid. And so in addition to our work with utilities, we're doing a lot of work with tribal entities, helping them secure federal funding for energy infrastructure projects, bringing energy into these historically underserved and under-resourced communities that have suffered some of the worst of not only energy access, but also climate change. And
that's important work to do, because that is a community who is suffered through a lot of, bad action, bad decisions, and neglect.
There's a deep debt to be paid there that I think the U.S. has not even begun to reckon with.
Have not scratched the surface on that. And I'm with you on that. Super cool stuff you're doing. I love, the story behind this. I'm excited to see where you go. I'm excited for microgrids. I want a microgrid in my backyard, but I'm going to be a ways away, here in Chicago. It's not the easiest, but I do appreciate what you're doing. It's very cool. And I love how you're serving underserved communities. It's a cool story. Keep up the good work and keep me posted, because I want to keep an eye on where you go from here.
Thank you. And what I want to say is a shout out to the people like you. A solar microgrid may not yet be cost effective or viable for you in Chicago, but a heat pump is. A heat pump water heater certainly is. Energy efficiency improvements, ground source heat pumps. There's such an incredible array of technologies available to homeowners. Under the new IRA and investment tax credit, there are rebates available for all of this. You can get a rebate for replacing your hot water heater, for putting in a more energy efficient stove. Obtaining a renewable microgrid for your community may be out of reach of the average US consumer, but reducing your energy impact and reducing your energy cost in a way that is doing something positive for the planet is something that everyone can do. So look into those options.
I think that's an important message for everybody to hear. So thank you for that. And thanks for being on. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely, Chris. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for watching. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. I would love to get your opinions about solar energy and BoxPower. And if you could, give us a like, think about subscribing, and I will see you in the next one.